Hello and welcome to our panel on collaboratives. Um, so for anyone who's not aware, we are streaming on YouTube, of course. We will be dropping a link in a second that has an option to donate to the Friends of Land, Air, Water, which is a alumni association that gives summer stipends to law students who are working in public interest work over the summer. So this panel, as I said, is on collaboratives. So for good reason, forest collaboratives have been widely celebrated. However, as collaboratives get increasingly social, political, and legal clout, many are beginning to raise serious concerns, especially conservationists. Therefore, it is equally important to recognize their shortcomings and their importance of preserving other avenues that allow the broad public to provide meaningful input in decisions made on public land. So our first presenter will be Emily Jane Davis, and she has done extensive research on forest collaboratives, including participating in and even facilitating collaboratives across the state of Oregon. She will discuss the history of forest collaboratives and provide an academic view on their present future. Second, we will have Rob Clavins from Oregon Wild. Rob has participated in forest collaboratives on behalf of many other NGOs in the state. He will share his organization's experience with collaboratives, successes and failures, and strengths/shortcomings with real world examples. And lastly, we will have Chandra Lagu from Oregon Wild as well, and she will be discussing the policy and the grounds implications of increased legal, social, and political stature of forest collaboratives. So here is Emily Jane Davis.
Hey everyone, nice to see you and thanks for having me here today. As Lisa said, I'm a social scientist from Oregon State University, and I specialize in understanding various forms of collaborative governance, of which forest collaboratives are one. So today I'll be speaking about those. As many of you know, these are groups of stakeholders that meet regularly for dialogue about a given area of federal forest land, have that dialogue about their values and interests, identify areas of agreement, and provide that input to the Forest Service. In this presentation, I'll be mainly using my research that I've done to explore what they are and what they do. And Rob asked me to provide a bit of this academic perspective. In the discussion, though, I'm also happy to bring up some of my experience as a technical assistance provider working more directly with the groups as well. The sources of information that I'll be using today are studies that I've done that have been funded by the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service and Oregon Department of Forestry. So that includes a survey of collaborative participants in Oregon, Federal Forest Restoration Program and Oregon grant evaluations, case studies, and a study of collaborative funding sources. And I hope that the main thing that you'll take home from my presentation today is that the collaboratives get referred to oftentimes as a monolithic phenomenon, and they actually really vary a lot. There's a lot of variability in how long these groups have been around, in the size, in the way they operate, in the outcomes we can identify from them. And even within those in the same group, we can see a lot of differences in motivations and visions of what collaboration is. Let's start with what we know from the academic literature about the term collaborative governance, which this is a form of. Generally, these are settings where public agencies, such as those that manage natural resources like the Forest Service, directly engage with stakeholders in consensus-oriented deliberative decision-making that's supposed to produce collective solutions. And the thing about collaborative governance is the literature also recognizes that we place a lot of expectation on it. We think that if we practice it, we'll maybe avoid the high costs of other adversarial means of policymaking or policy implementation. We'll expand the democratic participation and even restore rationality to public management. So there's a pretty tall order. And it's a lot of work to do collaborative governance. And there is vast literature about what can make that more successful or not. I don't expect you to read all the words on this slide, but I just want to show you that, there are a lot of variables that can affect how well it functions, mainly the conditions under which it occurs, how facilitative the leadership within and facilitators are, the institutional design, and the collaborative process. So there's just a lot to think about with designing effective collaboration, and the components intersect too. So for example, if you have an imbalance in stakeholder power or resources coming in, the leadership approach and the choice of process design might help affect that. So all that to say that it takes a lot of work and there's a lot to think about. Collaborate is a form of public participation. This is a public participation schematic that is sometimes used to describe different ways that stakeholders might interact with public agencies. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but if you look at Inform over there on the left, that's really, one directional. The agency is telling people or stakeholders what it's going to do, and there aren't a lot of opportunities for input. As you move along the spectrum, the opportunities for input increase in terms of frequency. There's also a degree of interaction amongst the participants, so they're not just communicating back and forth with the agency in a bilateral way. They're actually being forced to navigate and negotiate amongst each other. So that's an important thing to understand about Collaborate. It isn't being consulted once or twice. It's an ongoing, sustained relationship with multiple meaningful opportunities for input that allows stakeholders to interact with each other in doing that. In Oregon, though, we don't just use collaborate as a noun and collaborative as a descriptive adjective. We're unique in that we really moved towards using the term collaborative as a noun to describe groups, and there's been a lot of interest and excitement around this model. There is not an official definition or arbiter of what a forest collaborative is, although I'll talk about some that are out there. This is a definition I developed and have been using in my work. So multi-stakeholder venues that exist for dialogue and provide input about plan management activities on National Forest System lands. They have to meet regularly, so they have ongoing relationships. And they tend to have missions that are focused on what we call a triple bottom line kind of economic, social, and ecological components of federal forest management. And interestingly, there is no straightforward answer to how many collaboratives there are in Oregon. There are different sources that have come out over the years. So the Forest Service did an inventory in 2017 that says there's 28. There was an Oregon Atlas of Collaboration put out in 2019 that says there's 25. My current understanding following my definition is that there's about 18. But just to show you that this phenomenon is not always even perfectly bounded. A brief history of what we're calling collaboratives in Oregon. So from the early 1990s to about the mid-early 2000s, I roughly call this the era of community-based forestry. This is when collaboratives first got started. Usually people begin this history with the Applegate Partnership in 1992, then groups like the Lakeview Stewardship Group and some of the early collaboration that happened on the Sayes Law in Malala County. This was largely more place-based and depended on local people and their interests, although there was a movement towards community-based forestry at the time around the West that a lot of these folks were connected into. Then the early 2000s to 2010 or so is a mixed bag. So you see more collaboration coming online, you see more groups forming, but the impetus was variable. So some of them were still pursuing that place-based, this makes sense in our area. Others were interested in the stories of other groups and what they were doing and wanted to try it out there. And others were motivated by the emphasis on collaboration and incentives for collaboration that were actually found in policies and programs like the National Fire Plan and the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. So there became that driver for it. So they're kind of popping up around the state in different locations for different reasons. And then on the far right, you see a pretty big increase in the number of collaboratives in Oregon after 2010. This is what Tim Lilleboe would refer to as collaboration going viral. So the Wallowa, Whitman, Umatilla, and Ochoco National Forests started up groups. There was also some gap filling that occurred in places like the Willamette and the Hood, where some ranger districts or watersheds had groups and others didn't. The trend at this time on the east side was to start larger groups concerned with entire national forests, as Rob will talk about. And now the Wallowa, Whitman, and Umatilla have since merged into a single collaborative that covers 2 forests. So pretty different than some of the more place-based collaboration at smaller spatial scales in the early days. On the west side, it has stayed a bit spatially smaller with a focus on a single ranger district or watershed, although as Chandra may note in her talk, the SAISLA is now forming a forest-wide collaborative as well. So what collaboratives do, over this more recent timeframe, the dominant emphasis has really been on collaborating during the NEPA process with the theory that proactively addressing areas of potential disagreement before a decision is signed is going to be a good thing to do. Some groups also collaborate pre-NEPA in doing watershed or landscape analyses. Others collaborate on decisions like how they'd like to see the retained receipts from stewardship contracting spent. And other groups support monitoring programs, and they spend time reviewing and learning from their monitoring data. The central theory of how collaboratives might affect the pace and scale of federal forest restoration has been that they bring together stakeholders to reach agreement, that will reduce objections and litigation, and that they'll also articulate broader, what they call zones of agreement, that potentially establish key areas of agreement that wouldn't have to be revisited on a project-by-project basis. So that's the theoretical hope. Starting in 2013, the Oregon legislature approved the Federal Forest Restoration Program. We're unique in the West for having this. It's supposed to support the increased pace and scale of restoration on federal forest lands in the state, and it includes a grant program for collaboratives, as well as other investments in capacity for increasing NEPA and technical assistance. For its first biennium, it was focused on the east side only, and for the last 3, it's been focused across the entire state. The Federal Forest Restoration Program is important because it really linked collaboratives to a vision of their ability to increase pace and scale, and really galvanized and provides the majority of support and funding for collaboratives. In order to get a collaborative grant, these are funded by ODF, but administered through Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. They did put some criteria in place. I bring this up just because this gets to that question of how is a collaborative defined. So what they're trying to do is put some bounds on what a collaborative has to have structurally in order to receive funding from the state. And these are supposed to be evidence of baseline capacity to sustain collaborative dialogue among diverse perspectives, but not be prescriptive about how that should look in one place. So they have to provide evidence of these kinds of organizational features. So now that we've talked about what collaboratives are, I'm just going to go ahead and briefly highlight a few of my studies before I wrap up. So first, this is the 2015 study that colleagues and I did where we surveyed forest collaborative participants in Oregon. We had 215 usable responses. We estimate that to be a response rate of 54% of the population of participants at that time, which is pretty good. One thing we looked at in this survey was motivations for collaboration, and we allowed participants to include all motivations, check all, as well as force them to select their primary motivation. And we broke those down by agency and non-agency participants because we actually found a statistically significant difference in there. So agency personnel were much more likely than, are more focused on the social motive of improving relationships and trust, much more than any. So almost 46% of our agency respondents were there for that reason. In contrast, non-agency participants didn't have a single motive that rose to the top so clearly. 20% of them were there for a primary motive of restoring forest resiliency, but that's not a majority by any means. So more diverse motivations amongst the non-agency participants. And why this is important is just to understand a little bit like why people are there. And this survey didn't even get into what that means. Obviously, when you break down what forest resiliency means, you can encounter a lot of different definitions within that. So the point is those motivations vary. Another aspect of collaboratives that really varies, and I don't think people appreciate enough, is their funding and capacity. So the resources that they have to operate and that they have to bring in other resources like scientists to work with them or studies that they can use in their work. Colleagues and I did a study of how forest collaboratives were funded from 2013 to 2018. So for a 5-year period, we looked at where they got their money from and how much they had. So the main take home is there's a lot of disparity. So the wheel on the left shows the total share of funding. So for that period, there were $4 million across all collaboratives for 5 years. There have been some groups that have a much larger share of that funding. The high of total funding for the 5-year period was about $944,000 with a low of $18,000. So that's $18,000 to operate for 5 years with an average of $188,000, again, for a total. A large majority of these groups, 19 of them, operated with less than $200,000 over a 5-year period, so to support their facilitation and their work. And then most groups rely on one or a few sources of funding. There is not a very broad bench for most groups. So the take home here is their financial situations and their ability to organize varies a good deal. Finally, there is a lot of interest, as I've noted, in understanding the relationship of collaboratives to the pace and scale of restoration, however you define that. Colleagues and I have looked at how the Federal Forest Collaborative grants in Oregon have been used. So these are groups that have received those grants. And that's for 2013 to 2018. And so again, you just see quite a lot of variability. So some groups that have been around for longer, they've been working in forest contexts that have a need to reduce fire risk and restore resiliency. They have the most acres planned and implemented, and economic impacts evident from that work. Many other groups were younger in age and don't really have those outcomes linked to their work yet, in part due to the amount of time it takes to move a project through the process. It's also worth noting that accelerated restoration or restoration means different things in different social, economic, and ecological settings. So the expectation of what that means across collaboratives should be pretty nuanced. Regardless of a group's age or where it was located, we did find that it was pretty universally understood that collaboratives contributed a lot to the quality of the discussion by bringing different kinds of scientific information, having dialogue about different resources that folks felt wouldn't have happened otherwise in a typical planning process. A substantial question at this point, though, still is how that's translating into outcomes on the ground, in part because it can take time for collaborative projects to actually make it through and get implemented. Our monitoring data to date also shows so far that the majority of collaboratively supported activities that are getting accomplished are commercial. This database that we used is not a very good database, and there's likely underreporting of activities in it. So that needs to be considered when using these data. But I guess I just want to note that that has been a challenge for some folks who are looking for a diversity of restoration outcomes. And there's also an unevenness here in the types of activities that have been implemented by forests. So some forests are responsible for a majority of these activities when they do get implemented. To finish and reflect on the potential future of collaboratives, I want to offer the perspective that they're really part of a much bigger picture. We're focusing on them today, but there's a lot going on around them that affects them and that needs to also be considered. So there's a growing emphasis on all land, shared stewardship, good neighbor authority. That can potentially make some collaboratives less powerful, or at least it places them within a more complicated landscape of different kinds of actors and partnerships and coalitions. So they're not the only kind of partnership model out on the landscape. There are some questions about future funding sources for them. So some of them have had more and diversified funding. Many of them are dependent on just a couple sources of funding that are pretty vulnerable. So their ability to exist, I think, is in question with that. Another trend is collaboratives do, as I noted, seem to be getting spatially bigger. They're covering a lot more ground, a lot more diversity of settings. And I think, collaborative processes are likely going to work differently at different scales. Some of the hallmarks of early collaboration that a lot of folks participated in were very intensive in terms of time spent together, time spent on the ground, eyes on the ground. And that's not necessarily possible at larger spatial scales. So what does that look like? There are continued unresolved questions or challenges that people who don't collaborate and people who do collaborate are grappling with. Understanding their actual influence over the Forest Service and their satisfaction with the outcomes they've spent a lot of time trying to achieve. Decision space during NEPA. If NEPA changes due to rulemaking and requirements for public participation change, that will change some of the space for collaboratives. There's also a lot of decisions that can be made post-NEPA that can affect outcomes on the ground, but there's not really a pathway for forest collaboratives to be involved in some of those implementation decisions and understand those. There's also some questions of representation. So collaboratives are a venue for participation. They set a table for dialogue, but not all public lands interests are able or willing to be at that table all the time. Other power disparities still exist that affect how people and organizations are able to come to that table. So the new administration's focus on equity and environmental justice will also likely drive other questions about the relationship of people to federal forest lands and create or change public participation opportunities. And then finally, the new administration may also set a different tone for other aspects of federal forest management. In addition to emphasizing equity and environmental justice, it's been emphasizing climate resiliency. So that might offer new and different framings and motivations for collaborative groups, or for new forms of organizing around these issues that are not collaborative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Chandra, who are going to be offering their experiences with specific collaboratives and specific contexts around the state. And I look forward to that and to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to see if I can get my presentation up here. And actually, Emily Jane, I can see, oh, I could see your face. I guess I'll just assume that somebody will shout at me if they don't see a nice photo of my wife and dog next to a big ponderosa pine. So yeah, thanks, Emily Jane. I really appreciated hearing that perspective. A lot of what you shared is complementary to what I intend to say, which, given how much I respect you and your work, really feels quite reassuring. It might go without saying, but I just want to flag for folks proactively that I'm only speaking for myself, so I suppose I should introduce myself. I'm Rob Clavins. I'm the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. We're a statewide membership organization that works to protect Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. I'm based in rural Wallowa County near the town of Enterprise, where my wife and I also run a working farm and bed and breakfast. It's just a really spectacular landscape that includes the Eagle Cap Wilderness, Hell's Canyon, Zumwalt Prairie, and actually has the most complete assemblage of wildlife in the state, including wolves, wolverine, and even moose. And it's actually more closely associated to the Rocky Mountain ecosystem than the Cascades. And I have to say that as someone who's decidedly not from here, I've just come to absolutely cherish this place. So it's no wonder to me that the Nimiipuu or Nez Perce tribe who have lived here since time immemorial never gave up their rightful claims to this place. After writing up an initial outline of my talk, I kind of wondered if I should have renamed my section, "No One Wants to Be the Skunk at the Garden Party." Even though I often feel like that's my role and it's an important one, I want to make a couple of points right up front. Speaking personally and for my organization, we believe deeply in the ideas of collaboration. We're proud that we've been founder of more than a few forest collaboratives. We've won multiple awards from government agencies, including the Forest Service and NRCS, for our work as good collaborators. For better or for worse, we are not a no-cut group. We've been involved in the development of thousands of projects over the years, and we've even developed and designed projects ourselves that sent logs to mills. And at one point, not that long ago, we were involved in more forest collaboratives than any NGO in the state, and that might still be true today. The other thing I think that's important in this conversation in the context of a law conference is that sometimes collaborative supporters like to frame up collaboratives as a response to litigation in a manner that somehow implies that holding the government accountable to its own laws is worse than the agencies breaking them in the first place, or the damage that would be done if we didn't have those laws and what was occurring unabated until those laws actually started being enforced. Our rule of thumb is almost always to try to get agencies and partners to do the right thing by asking nicely first and trying to find common ground. But when that doesn't work and laws have been broken, yes, sometimes we do go to court. So some of you may know one of Oregon Wild's legendary staffers, Tim Lilbo. He died about 8 years ago, but I think telling his journey is a good way to tell our own. Tim was himself a logger at one point in his life. However, as he saw the industry he worked for decimating the places that he loved so deeply, he began his career as a conservationist. And he often spoke of how for a while his mantra was not another stick, which is to say no more logging on public lands, full stop. And at that time, when the last of the old growth and our unroaded forests were in the crosshairs of industry, that was absolutely the right position. Over time, though, Tim began to think that we might find common ground with other stakeholders and better processes to get to better and more durable solutions. So with the advent of important environmental protections like the Northwest Forest Plan, the East Side Screens, and the roadless rule, we saw tired old debates about whether or not to do things like log old growth taken off the table, and the conditions were set so that we could take some leaps of faith. By their own admission, in a number of cases, the timber industry was happy for the opportunity to convince willing conservationists that there was a role for some level of logging on our forests, and despite some resistance, we were willing to try. So following Tim's lead and that of agency visionaries like Jim Furnish, we began that era of collaboration, and we had some wonderful successes. Those successes have been deservedly celebrated over the years, But things started to change for Tim in the months before his death, and they've continued to devolve since. Having helped start two new collaboratives in Northeastern Oregon, where legitimate collaboration is something that local provincial interests still can't really seem to get right, Tim saw his and our willingness to compromise taken advantage of. And what may have been his last email, he wrote this to two confidants at the Umatilla Collaborative. And I'm reading from that email. He said, "I'm getting a bit concerned with the possible direction of Eastside collab groups. I started out a few years ago saying, don't cut another damn stick on public lands. Then let's consider some non-commercial thinning. Then let's consider some commercial thinning for ecological restoration reasons. Then let's set some parameters that would allow commercial logging in many dry forest types for ecological restoration reasons. Then let's explore and consider some possible actions in altered moist mixed conifer forests like plantations. Then let's consider some possible actions in plantations for ecological restoration reasons. Then let's consider analyzing some buffers around plantations for ecological restoration reasons. I might have just gone too friggin' far. All I hear from several of the collaborative interest groups is, let's log more trees. Let's log more large trees for economic reasons. Let's consider logging old growth trees for economic reasons. Let's log the moist mixed conifer for economic reasons. Let's log the buffers around old clear cuts with new small clear cuts and get more trees. In my view, I did not sign up for this. I'm pretty concerned that the push to get more volume is starting to overshadow forest ecological restoration concerns. Well, bitch, 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 vent, vent, vent. Thanks for your ears." And I want to reiterate that I and Oregon Wild continue to believe strongly in the collaborative ideals and goals. We value good process, we're willing to compromise, and we want to find agreement. And yet it's good outcomes that are what matter most to us. And I want to reiterate that. To us, it's the outcomes that matter most. And as I delve into the substance of my talk, I want to highlight that if you walk away with one thing from my talk, and I hope that it's not all collaboration is created equal. And before I really dive in, I think it's important to remember that to the extent our public lands belong to any of us, they belong to all of us equally, not just those of us lucky enough to live near them. You know, even if every one of the citizens of New York wanted to melt down the Statue of Liberty, we would have every right to raise our voices against that and to be heard. In fact, agencies like the Forest Service were created in large part to ensure that provincial interests didn't get to dictate the fate of the values on our public lands that matter to all of us, which is why we have laws like NEPA that ensure scientific scrutiny, meaningful public involvement, and adherence to the law in decisions that affect our public lands. So from our perspective, collaboration works best when it's a complement to, rather than a substitute for, public process and robust analysis. Also, when trying to find agreement between stakeholders with competing interests on controversial issues like the ones that are often tackled in forest collaboratives, we believe that good collaboration works best when there are agreed upon rules and sideboards, and that includes bedrock environmental laws. If we're going to go back to debating cutting big old trees or logging roadless areas or important wildlife habitat, we're not going to get very far. Another thing that in our experience, successful collaboratives also embody the principle of go slow to go fast. They start on small projects and on relatively non-controversial subjects before moving on to bigger things. They don't just assume that anything is easy or that we all agree on something. And importantly, they welcome and meaningfully consider new voices along the way, as well as those not able to participate, even when they're not in the majority. And lastly, they generally have associated agency staff willing to listen and adjust and go slow at times. So to me, I hear the words pace and scale. Good collaboration, though, isn't about doing things bigger and faster. To the extent that collaboratives make decision-making more efficient, it's by having robust discussions and helping agencies better understand where there is and is not social license, and then applying that learning to other projects. And similarly, it's my belief that success shouldn't just be measured by what we do in meetings, but what we and the agencies do outside of the collaboratives as well. And we've seen some great successes with whole collaboratives and even with individual projects in dysfunctional collaboratives like those here in Northeastern Oregon. We're proud to have been part of many of those successes. And again, I want to reiterate that they should be celebrated. Yet, I think it's important to note it's no less important to look at where collaboratives have been challenged, where they've fallen short, or where they outright failed. And it's also important to recognize and grapple with their inherent flaws and shortcomings. In my experience, that sort of comment might, get some nods of agreement if said out loud at a collaborative meeting, but we'd quickly, that would be the extent of it. And it wouldn't take long before we got back to the agenda and started designing our website to share our great successes with the world and pat ourselves on the back. Collaboratives are necessarily exclusive. And that is a real justice and equity issue. They have a real bias towards those who live near where meetings occur. They favor interest with the time, money, and staff and resources to commit to day-long meetings, subcommittees, working groups, and field trips. And Emily Jane talked about how many collaboratives out there, as these forest collaboratives proliferate, there are now dozens of formal, informal, and even sort of these meta collaborative groups around the region. So for a group like ours, we could use 100% of our resources on collaboratives and still be outnumbered and outshouted by industry interests who can have 5 people at the collaborative table while employing 10 lobbyists to simultaneously work to undermine the underlying environmental laws that make good outcomes possible. Meanwhile, we're also challenged when an agency works in good faith at the collaborative table while developing controversial and destructive proposals elsewhere on the landscape. And finally, collaborative groups often become insular, self-congratulatory, and defensive. Collaboratives and collaborative members will often decry outside groups for criticizing their work or the projects that they support. But what they're ignoring is the fact that such failures are not the failures of those, quote, outside groups, but rather the failings of the collaborative and the agencies to recognize the legitimacy and perspectives of the broad public who, for a host of reasons, aren't able to be at the table. Excuse me. And I think a great recent example is the undermining of Oregon's of old growth protections in Eastern Oregon by the Trump administration. The decision was opposed by over 100 independent scientists, former leadership of the Forest Service, and dozens of conservation, climate, indigenous, wildlife, and other organizations. Yet the much ballyhooed Blue Mountain Forest Partners has gone to great lengths to support the controversial decision and undermine those of us fighting it. And to me, and I think anyone paying close attention, even if they prevail in getting their way, it's a Pyrrhic victory. It only discredits that group and those living in its echo chamber and rightfully draws scrutiny to the validity and standing of collaboration broadly. And here's where I really become the skunk at the garden party. Whether explicit or not, collaboratives also tend to require that participants share a number of assumptions. They generally include that our forests are unhealthy, that we can log our way to forest health, that industrial logging, grazing, and mining have a rightful place on our public lands, and that holding the government accountable to its own laws through litigation is a bad thing and worse than agencies breaking and bending those laws in the first place. And if you don't share those and other assumptions, you and your views are not really going to be welcome. And having been at collaboratives that are almost exclusively focused on chainsaw restoration, I can tell you that it's exhausting to constantly be presented with bad idea after bad idea after bad idea, and then be the only person to say no, 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 and then be criticized because all you ever do is say no, no, no. Eventually, most folks in that position leave and or they cede the field to the lowest common denominator. And as an aside, I should note that by design, collaboratives also create tremendous social pressure to go along, to get along. The other day, I did an interview with a reporter, and after he heard me ramble on, he summarized what I'd said as collaboratives started out asking the question to log or not to log. And then they moved on to how much should we log and can we find new reasons to log? And I thought that was really well put, and it echoes, Tim's email, and I want to steal that description from him. Collaboratives never really started asking other fundamental questions, expanding the focus, or challenging fundamental ways of thinking. We hear forest collaboratives use terms like restoration and resilience, and they invoke science, but the reality is that it's almost always discussions about chainsaw restoration. The high-minded ideals about not negotiating but collaborating are just not realistic, or at least they're not shared by everyone equally, which means that those most willing to compromise are simply taken advantage of. And from their inception, the sometimes explicit but nearly always de facto goal of collaboratives have been to get conservationists to lay down their weapons, to compromise and give cover to log our public lands. And that hasn't really changed. So in forest collaboratives that I've been a part of, we rarely talk about, or we actually never talk about protecting public lands. Collaboratives rarely meaningfully consider road restoration, beaver recovery, fish passage, ending reflexive fire suppression, wildfire use, grazing reform, investing in recreation infrastructure, addressing underfunded agencies, or changing the extractive-based metrics by which agency leaders are graded. And I think this one's really important, fixing the underlying problems in the forest rather than just the symptoms. Instead, we just talk about where we can log, how much we can log, how fast, and how many ways we can stretch the comfort level of those most concerned about ecological outcomes and who believe that we should concern ourselves with the function of forest or who believe that nature can effectively and efficiently restore and maintain itself if given a chance. And as collaboratives like the Siuslaw demonstrated great success, other regions like mine try to replicate it without putting in the work. So newer collaboratives like the Wallowa Whitman and the Umatilla that Tim helped start with great hope, he and we only saw quickly devolve. And they devolved in part because they didn't start small. They didn't honor rules and sideboards. They went for big and fast and controversial, and they assumed agreement without establishing it. And quite frankly, they let bullies win. I think all collaboratives are susceptible to being dominated by a few strong personalities, and that was really the case out here. So there were no repercussions for outfits who banned groups like ours from public events, or county commissioners and industry leaders who yelled and swore, stormed out of meetings, and explicitly said we had no right to be at the negotiating table. Meanwhile, when we asked our members to weigh in against logging thousands of acres of roadless areas in the controversial Lower Joseph project, those same interests seriously discussed trying to have us banned from the group. And Chandra's going to talk about how the uncritical view of collaboration is leading to some scary policy decisions and some bad social and ecological outcomes. And that includes how collaboratives are often used to green or whitewash bad decisions and provide easy ways for leaders to sidestep their responsibility for taking challenging positions on the management of our public lands. And that's exacerbated by what I call the collaborative industrial complex. As collaboratives grow, some groups and individuals make big money. Some make money by taking huge cuts of pass-through grants as admin fees. Others contract to do work directly for the Forest Service or the collaborative. Some groups get money to collaborate, and the collaboratives themselves have full-time employees and contractors. And all of that money is far more likely to go to groups and individuals that go with the program, get with the program, and oftentimes value agreement for its own sake instead of the quality of outcomes, which sometimes requires saying no. You're more likely to get a grant if you gloss over or even sometimes outright lie about collaborative failures. Money rarely goes to groups that talk about how they were able to hold the line or stop a bad decision from happening, or acknowledge that their biggest success was in making something that was going to be really awful instead just be merely bad. Conservation advocates are generally the only ones at the table without a financial incentive to be there. So within those circumstances, finding agreement and defining agreement as success becomes more important than good outcomes. Talking about success as rewarded while spending any real time looking at failures is a waste of time and makes you a spoil sport. And that was made clear to me recently when a, we'll say, colleague whose salary is paid by their collaborative reacted really strongly to the conservation community's opposition to the Trump screens and our decision to publicly call out some collaboratives for their shortcomings. When I relayed that discussion back to our executive director, he shared an Upton Sinclair quote with me that said, "It's difficult to get a person to understand something when their salary depends upon his not understanding it." So as I close out, I want to note that there are some concerns, a number of other concerns that I won't proactively go over today, like applying the term collaborative to groups and processes that are anything but, or extrapolating situational agreements to much broader scales. At nearly every Oregon Wild annual staff retreat that I've attended, we've had some sort of discussion about how collaboration is going. And when I started working on collaboratives, most of the conversations were about successes, and we even discussed leaving some because we simply weren't needed anymore for them to succeed. But year after year, that conversation has taken a step in a different direction. We seem to be at a point where most collaboratives are greater cause for concern than hope. There are places where we're asked to spend more time to achieve worse results and then see our participation used to greenwash destructive decisions inside and outside the collaborative process. And again, I want to say I've been a part of some collaborative successes and worked with some really wonderful collaborators like Bill Gamble, Mike Rasbach, Laura Navarrete, and Carrie Spradlin of the Forest Service, as well as folks like Emily Jane and Carrie Kemp. But on balance, the collaboratives have been incredibly dysfunctional in Eastern Oregon in recent years. And for me, the final straw was when our collaborative insisted on engaging in the controversial Trump screens process over the reasoned and repeated objections of the two remaining local conservation advocacy organizations. And that happened concurrently with a rewrite of our operating principles that, among other things, refused to recognize the validity of concerns from outside stakeholders. So last year, both groups left, but the collaborative, as insular and exclusive as ever, goes on and celebrates itself as being smaller but mighty and represents the radical center. No self-awareness, no humility, no changes made, just business as usual. And after our decision, we offered to correct rumors, to answer questions and concerns, and have a face-to-face conversation with the group. But the leaders of the collaborative made very clear that that was not welcome. And Oregon Wild is not alone. While collaboration still has great potential, and we're seeing even many mainstream groups with long histories of collaborative involvement and success are seeing the same problems and walking away. So I think I've talked long enough, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and robust discussion, so I'll leave it there. But before I do hand it over to Chandra, I want to reiterate that I believe collaboration does have a lot to offer, but not if we don't recognize its shortcomings and failures and meaningfully address them. I think it's important to recognize that simply calling something collaborative does not make it so. And it's critical that even the best collaboration leave room for the rest of the world and act as a complement to, rather than a replacement for, good public process. Dysfunctional as they may have been, speaking personally, I'm glad that I spent the better part of a decade working in collaboration. I learned how to listen to understand and how to speak to be understood. I got to know some wonderful people, and I really appreciate that I got to spend thousands of hours listening to people with whom I fundamentally disagree, and at least try to understand them and find common ground. So I hope that's something I can try again someday, but it will have to be worth my time and worth our supporters' money. So with that, I want to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Chandra.
Real quick before Chandra gets started, I wanted to remind our viewers on YouTube that you can ask questions in the chat as speakers are going, and then they will be answered at the end.
Okay, thank you. Let me get to my screen to share here. All right. Well, thank you, Rob and Emily Jane. That was great, and I'll try not to duplicate too much. So my name is Chandra Legui. I have been living and working in and exploring Oregon from Eugene for over 20 years. And with Oregon Wild, I've been involved in campaigns to protect the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, fight the Bureau of Land Management's plan revisions, and elevate the connection between protecting and restoring forests with climate change. And I work to educate and engage my community and Oregon Wild supporters about the importance of the work we do. I've also been involved in some forest collaboratives and stewardship groups, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, for many years. In fact, looking back through some old documents to prepare for this, I found that I first organized a PILC panel on collaboration in 2007. And Emily Jane, you were on that panel. In case you were wondering about this photo, these are my cats, Gizmo and Ruby. And you'll notice the theme of some cat pictures, not only just to have fun, but also because as I was thinking about forest collaboratives and the theme of taking the good with the bad, I couldn't help but compare that to my cats and cats overall. In this case, I have a very sweet cat and a grumpy cat, the good and the bad. And overall, collaboratives can be tricky to navigate, have both risks and rewards. And you have to remember that you are never the boss of them, no matter how hard you try. So that's my silly theme for the day. Before I talk about some of my experiences, I do want to acknowledge that, as Emily Jane said, and you've heard from Rob as well, there's a lot of variability in collaboratives, their focus, their outcomes, funding, their participants. And I don't have knowledge of all West Side Oregon collaboratives, so there are probably some folks out there listening who participate in those and have a different perspective or experience. So those might come up later. So as Rob noted, Oregon Wild has spent many years and been fairly successful at stopping illegal projects that harm fish and wildlife habitat or other public resources through using the public comment process via NEPA or through litigation. And while it's vital that we have those tools to fight projects like really bad projects, that also leaves out the other side of the coin, which is actually encouraging our federal agencies to do the good, ecologically beneficial restoration projects that we support. And so that's where forest collaboratives come in and where they've been most successful on the West Side. So Rob talked about Tim Lilleboe and how he said it was important to have sideboards in order to set the conditions for working together and starting to take some leaps of faith. And on the west side, the opportunity to find that common ground came with the Northwest Forest Plan in the 90s. So coming fresh off of the timber wars of the 80s and 90s, I will tell you that taking the leap to work with the Forest Service in collaboration in Western Oregon was not easy. But because the Northwest Forest Plan placed most of the Siuslaw National Forest, this is a coast range forest, into old growth and riparian reserves for protecting and restoring salmon and other threatened forest species habitat, the sideboards that we were beginning to work under were pretty significant and really good. Also, visionary forest leaders on the Siuslaw really helped transform that national forest from the old growth logging capital of Oregon to a forest that was based in restoration and partnerships. So forest collaboratives in the Siuslaw National Forest are really better known as stewardship groups because the primary focus has been on using stewardship contracting, a new contracting tool that began in 1999. The groups, which were focused on a watershed scale within the Siuslaw National Forest, work with the Forest Service to develop ecologically based forest thinning projects in plantations that helped move plantations toward better habitat conditions for spotted owls, and then use the money generated from those logs to fund salmon stream restoration, decommission roads, and otherwise do habitat restoration, again, within the sideboards of the Northwest Forest Plan. Field trips and multi-party monitoring built trust within these groups and ensured that things were happening that we liked. And our interests in this forest were in alignment, supporting the investment and commitment to forest and watershed restoration, where commercial logs were just a byproduct and not the end goal. And over the past 20 years, many millions of dollars have been invested in really great restoration through stewardship groups and their partnerships. So translating a successful model in one place to another can be difficult. And that's been my experience with another stewardship group in the Mackenzie watershed on the Willamette National Forest. On the Willamette National Forest, the sideboards that we enjoyed on the Siuslaw aren't there. They're still under the Northwest Forest Plan, but they're not all the forest isn't placed into reserves that is focused on restoration. There's still some focus on logging, native forests, which is controversial and not something that we approve of. So that agreement around what the group should focus on has been a bit hard to come by. Aquatic restoration, road decommissioning, water quality, absolutely. Agreeing on aggressive logging without an ecological objective just to generate funds for that restoration, not cool. So I spent a lot of time in that group saying no, 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 as Rob described, seeking the outcomes that made participation worthwhile. And ultimately, I stopped participating last year because I couldn't get to those outcomes. However, it does seem like some of the skunk at the garden party efforts that I made are being incorporated into the group now. They're staying away from using stewardship contracting for logging in old forest stands, for example, which is one of the things that I was really adamant about. So you'll notice that I put up a slide that I'm not actually talking about, but hopefully encapsulates some of the things that both Rob and I have talked about. And again, cat pictures, all focus on negotiating a space. So there are a few Westside collaboratives that are now taking an approach a bit closer to those in Eastern Oregon, biting off bigger conversations at a forest scale where there might be fewer sideboards and less agreement. The Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative is one example that I actually think checks a lot of the good boxes that both Emily Jane and Rob have talked about, some of these best practices. The group started slow, focusing on shared learning, engagement of a really diverse group of community members and stakeholders. And they're taking the time to develop working agreements. There's a good facilitator, there's a lot of engagement from the Forest Service. And the group dived in to tackle a large landscape scale planning effort through that process. Now, as NEPA projects start to come out of that planning effort, I feel confident that they're going to be better because of our and the rest of the group's input. But there's no guarantee that we're going to agree with every aspect of the projects that come out of this collaborative. In fact, we have some serious issues with the first one coming out. But so far we feel heard, and we don't feel bullied by the collaborative to go along with everything the Forest Service comes out with. Emily Jane mentioned this, but on the Siuslaw National Forest as well, they're moving not away from the stewardship groups, but in addition to the stewardship groups, working to develop a forest-wide forest collaborative. In recent years, some of the conservation interests, like Oregon Wild, that have been involved in stewardship groups, started raising questions about the design of the thinning projects on the Siuslaw and wanted to be more involved in some of the big picture science and issues in the forest. So there's a new effort to build a broader forest collaborative to address some of those concerns and interests, and hopefully we'll learn from the successes, challenges, and failures of other groups in the region. I do have hope in this new process for getting to a place where the eventual outcomes mean better projects on the ground, better ecological outcomes. But it's still in the early stages, and so a lot can go right or potentially wrong. All right, I'm going to shift now to zoom back out to some of the implications of the proliferation of forest collaboratives across the region. Emily Jane talked a bit about that growth of forest collaboratives over time. And one of the reasons for that expansion is the support that the idea of collaboration has gotten from federal agencies, from politicians, from academics, and as she noted, a growing number of laws, policies, and authorities that pertain to our public land management actually encourage or require collaboration. So I've put together a couple of examples of some of those laws and policies. And I want to call particular attention to how collaboration is or is not defined. So starting with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act from 2003, among other things, like change how NEPA is done for certain projects, including adding categorical exclusions, which exempt public participation and robust analysis. So we have major problems with the HFRA in many ways. But this act also encouraged meaningful public participation during preparation of projects and to facilitate collaboration as they do that. And in that bill, it means simply including representatives from a variety of groups, you can see listed here, during the development of fuels reduction projects. But beyond that, collaboration is not defined. The HFRA has been expanded several times since 2003, including in the 2014 Farm Bill, which added a new categorical exclusion for insect and disease infestation that allows treatment of up to 3,000 acres. So in this expansion, collaboration is actually defined in a different way, as in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, or CFLRP. So how is collaboration defined there? So CFLRP was passed in 2009. And the aim was to enhance forest health, reduce risk of fire, and benefit rural communities through collaborative science-based approaches to forest management. There's a few of these projects there you have to apply to get funding and to develop these projects at a large landscape scale. And there's a few of them in Oregon. And how collaboration is defined is that in order to be a go, projects need to be developed and implemented through a collaborative process as defined as including multiple and diverse interests, and is transparent and non-exclusive, or meets the requirements for a resource advisory committee. And that's a whole other can of worms I'm not going into. But just to note that it's a little bit more defined as to what collaboration means here. Okay, a couple more. I talked a little bit about stewardship contracting on the Siuslaw National Forest. That was an authority first piloted in 1999 and then made permanent in 2014. And it's a way of doing work on public lands that generates funds that can then be used for restoration projects And it also highlights collaboration. It's not in the text of any law, but the Forest Service handbook says that collaboration must be a part of stewardship project planning. And other direction includes that they should be developed, that stewardship projects should be developed collaboratively with, a list of stakeholders, and that public input from a collaborative group or other stakeholders should guide the agency as they determine stewardship projects. But again, other than that, collaboration isn't defined. And then finally, as Emily Jane talked a little bit about, the state of Oregon has embraced collaboration on public lands through the Federal Forest Restoration Program that's administered through the Oregon Department of Forestry. And so, as she described it, the goal of that is to accelerate the pace, scale, and quality of forest restoration on public lands, something that we can probably argue about for hours if we really wanted to. And it gives some credence to collaboratives. The goal is to empower collaboratives, to fund collaboratives, in order to facilitate that pace, scale, and quality of restoration across the state. And there's a little bit more thought given to what that means, as she described. But it's still fairly loose, and collaboratives and technical assistance for them are being funded to the tune of $4 or $5 million through that program so far. So there's definitely things at stake. So for better or for worse, with those laws and policies directing collaboration, it seems that it's here to stay on federal forest management. But given the mixed performance and reviews of forest collaboratives, as we've discussed, there are several reasons why the increased authority and use of collaboration is problematic. And Rob already talked about some of this, but first and foremost, all of these authorities and direction in law and policy, however it's defined or not defined, it points agencies and decision makers towards forest collaboratives. They're given a lot of authority, even legal standing in some cases, even when there aren't actually standards that apply to them. That's a problem. In the example of the new Farm Bill CE, for example, that I mentioned, that allows projects, commercial logging projects potentially under that insect and disease qualification, means large, potentially controversial and ecologically damaging projects don't get a robust analysis under that CE or public involvement, and they can be called collaborative without any real standards. Next, agencies and politicians give added credibility to projects that are supported by collaboratives. So projects might get a stamp of approval. And so, proponents can hold up a project as a good example, regardless of the legitimacy of the process or the level of controversy that might have led to the collaborative decision. So I'm going to switch slides just because more cat pictures. And then, of course, not all collaboratives meet the criteria that we might all agree on as being legitimate or successful. So, for example, Rob's neck of the woods, and he said he wasn't going to go into but there are, county committees that funnel information from stakeholders or in theory, and have a lot of influence on consequential proposals like revisions to entire forest plans. And those groups aren't actually representative or bringing differing stakeholders together, but they're given deference, the deference of a collaborative by agencies and others who like what they hear from those groups. Rob also talked about chainsaw restoration, and that happens on the west side too. When the Forest Service or the state government has goals for collaboration that are tied to the pace and scale and of restoration, and restoration is primarily measured as acres treated and board feet, as it has been for the past several years, it's problematic. It automatically ties the hands of a collaborative that might have different ideas about what they want to do, or pushes the collaborative to go along with or come to support projects that only meet those pace and scale goals. And finally, all of this increased power given to collaboratives is problematic due to the inequities related to participation in them. And Rob and Emily Jane talked about that a bit already. Participation can be really time consuming or not take into into account factors that exclude certain groups, like having meetings during the day or on tribal holidays. So yeah, as Rob mentioned, they're necessarily exclusive in some ways. They're biased towards people who live nearby and can spend a lot of time and resources attending meetings. And there are plenty of people who care about public lands who don't have those resources to participate. Though I must add that the switch to Zoom meetings may make participation more accessible for many, just on a time spent sort of calculus. And believe me, it's a major stretch for groups like ours and many nonprofits, even with paid staff, to commit to that sort of time, especially when there's trade-offs. For us, it's, do we spend time writing in-depth comments on a NEPA document, or engaging partners on a major public lands protection bill, or scoping out a potentially terrible timber sale that we need to get pictures of, or attend a collaborative meeting where we're not sure if we're going to get outcomes that we can agree with. So in the end, is it worthwhile to keep collaborating, to take the good with the bad? Honestly, each participant or critic needs to make that determination on their own, much like cat ownership. The sideboards and protections that allowed us to come to the table around restoration on national forests have changed in a lot of ways. With new categorical exclusions, with erosion of other environmental laws, with the targets of board feet that are elevated over things like climate change or saving wildlife habitat. And we're working within a system that still allows logging of our last remaining old forests. Increased timber targets on many forests and this push for pace and scale restoration means that collaborative groups are often compromising ecologically based restoration for these volume-driven targets with little analysis. And at the same time, real restoration is underfunded. Monitoring and adaptive management that allow us to learn from what we're doing is shortchanged. So there's problems. With or without collaboratives, though, the Forest Service will continue to do controversial and damaging projects, making collaboratives less relevant in some ways, because they can still do those things, while also using collaborative groups as a shield for decisions that many groups just can't support. As Emily Jane noted, a shift in the direction for agencies in this new administration might help us there. There might be a new focus on climate resiliency, for example, and that could bring new opportunities for forest collaboratives to be involved in tackling some important issues that are more in line with the ecological outcomes that conservationists are seeking, and not as focused on the board feet. Could go either way. So with that, I think I will stop as well and turn it back over to the group.
All right, so we are going to move into our question and answer portion. So our first question comes from Marina Ritchie, and it says, what if rather than continuing to participate in chainsaw forestry collaboratives, what about putting forward a plan for new ecological climate forward collaboratives?
I love it. I mean, I think, and actually before I start, I want to just put on the record that Chandra, I laughed at every one of your cat jokes and appreciated it. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, does it have to be a new collaborative? I think one of the frustrations is that, and again, speaking from my experience, is that we tried time and again to say, it's fine that we're doing X, Y, and Z. Can we also talk about A, B, and C? And usually the response was from the industry, well, if we start doing that, you're not meeting our goals and we can't do it. And I'm thinking, well, X, Y, and Z isn't meeting our goals. And in the end, we kept getting these token nods. It didn't happen. And that was part of why we left the collaboratives that I'm a part of. And so why can't, if we started to have, the climate question we had, and I'm not kidding, was from one of our minutes said, open questions. Is climate change real? And if so, what should we do about it? Is that a good use of my time to be at a collaborative where we're going to discuss whether or not climate change is real? But if we were actually having discussions about how we could sequester more carbon on the landscape, and to do all sorts of other things. I think that would be beneficial, but it's not just a collaborative problem. It's a problem of this really extremely underfunded agency. And sorry, Lisa, you heard me say this the other day, but I'll say it again because it's really important, where the deciders at the Forest Service, from top to bottom, their measurements of success are acres treated, and treated means generally logged, and board feet sent to the mills. What if we change those fundamental measures of success as how many salmon returned, how many snags are on the landscape, how many roads were restored, how much carbon is sequestered on the landscape, how many species were restored, what are the water temperatures? We would get really, really different results and different projects, and the conversations would be different. And similarly, even when we're talking about economics, what if it wasn't just profit sent to timber executives at Lake Oswego or in Idaho, but what if it was also recreation, dollars in the local community? What if it was prescribed, the jobs that are provided by prescribing fire, fixing the road system, the increases of quality of life, and the jobs that generates in rural communities, which is far more than the boom bust industries of timber and grazing and mining and those sorts of things. So I think that's a great idea, but it speaks more broadly, not just to starting new collaboratives that take more time and maybe will only get some participation, but how do we change the fundamental paradigm of how we're making decisions? Well, we are at a time of ecological crisis in terms of climate and biodiversity and all of these other things.
What a very thoughtful answer. Our next question says, these issues you're discussing are fascinating. What can people who are not a part of the legal community do to address these issues?
I can answer part of that, but I would welcome my other panelists to weigh in as well. And you definitely don't need to be part of a legal community to take part in Forest Collaborative. And that's the point I want to make, is that many of them, and if they're not, they should be, are open to the public. They should be about engaging the public in what's happening on our public lands. And so, I mentioned the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative on the Willamette National Forest, and there's a lot of community members from rural communities who participate in that group, and they come to the table to learn about the forest that surrounds their community and sort of, learn from scientists, learn from the agency, learn from each other, and then participate in the collaborative process. And I think that's a really great model. It doesn't happen everywhere, however, and it can take, a lot of that time coming up to speed, and a lot of, if you have a full-time job, it's hard to attend those meetings as a regular citizen. But there might be opportunities, and so I would encourage folks to seek those out if you do have the time, or seek out organizations that are participating that align with your values, and let them know what your concerns are, and see if you can't be represented in that way.
Do we have any other follow-up answers to that question, or should we move to the next one?
That was great.
So our next question from CJ Lockwood says, do you find that agencies like USFS take NEPA comments more seriously when they are from distinguished organizations or a larger pool of concerned citizens?
I would say, it's interesting tying that to the last question too. When I started at Oregon Wild, we had an executive director named Regna Merritt. And I remember when I asked her what her reason, how she, was making the small talk as a new employee. How did you start, how did you come on this path to do this job? And she talked about how she had been working on forest issues for a long time and felt like she was constantly being ignored. And she asked somebody at the Forest Service, like, what do I have to do for you guys to finally care about what I say? And they said, well, will you sue us? And she was like, no. And he said, well, find somebody who will go take us to court and maybe we'll start listening. And the reality is that really sucks. And that was the reality back in the day. And it shouldn't be that way. Agencies should do things for the right reasons. They're public agencies. They represent the public. They have laws, all of these things. But anyway, it shouldn't be that way. But the reality is that to a certain extent it is. And it is, but it isn't just legal, it isn't just legal. It is a lot of other ways that you can, have some clout. So I don't necessarily know exactly what distinguished means. But I think that that's, there's at its best, collaboration should provide a venue for citizens to participate. And I think about also groups like ours. We represent over 20,000 members and supporters who choose to support us. But our political clout is way less than my county commissioner who won the election not by 2,000 votes, but with 2,000 votes. And so I think that there is a real unfortunate disparity in that. And so that is where sometimes we do need to be reaching out to elected officials and others call your, the constant refrain of call your congressman, call your senator. It's really important. And that is one of the risks actually of collaboration is when then those folks start to say, well, actually there's a collaborative out there and they support this decision. So I think it's really important, as Chandra said, to find your voice and to make sure that you don't have to be an expert on the issue, but to engage and also to support organizations that do represent your values. And so, that could be an organization like ours. It could be, any number of others as well that do work different ways. So sorry, that was a little bit rambling. But the short answer is yes, certain voices do matter more. And certainly I think it's important to take those actions too of, send the click. How many times I've seen agencies just dismiss, members of the public of like, oh, well, you're just an Oregon Wild member. We got 65 emails. That just counts as one. So it's frustrating, but it's something anyway, it's constantly, we're going to have to keep working on. And that is why public interest groups like ours try really hard to provide, to be a voice for the people who do support us and listen to those voices. Sorry, that was very rambling.
That was a great answer. I would not categorize it as rambling. But our next question says, how would someone involved in a collaborative avoid some of the pitfalls involved?
That's a hard one. That's why no one's speaking up.
Yeah, I think it's hard for an individual, is part of the reality. You can be part of the leadership, but I think part of it is it requires somewhat of magnanimous leadership. And it's hard to spend the time. But I think that's where, it's as I said, it's a difficult thing, at least from the conservation perspective, to have to be in a position to say no pretty regularly. But you have to be willing to say no, and you have to be willing. And this is my perspective of, I hope my presentation didn't come off as like a hit piece on collaboration, because we spend so much time celebrating collaboratives, and we don't talk enough about the shortcomings. And maybe this is a strained metaphor, but it's sort of like how I see patriotism. Patriotism doesn't mean I love America regardless of what it does. It's accepting the fact that we have a system where we can look at what we've done wrong and do better in the future. But we can't do better unless we're actually acknowledging those shortcomings and the failures. So I think that a big piece of it is truly to be, if you're a member of a collaborative and it doesn't feel right, to address those issues. And so if you're noticing, wow, we're all agreeing on this, but I'm not sure how somebody else would feel, speak up and say, we need to listen to the conservation community, to the indigenous community, to the people who are stakeholders from far away. So it's not really easy, but I think there's a level of accountability that needs to be there that simply isn't. And so you can do that if you're participating.
I think that's right on, Rob. And one thing I might add, just like on a specific pitfall, you brought it up in your talk a bunch about how important outcomes are. So I think it's important, to being part of a collaborative, to stay focused on the outcomes that, align with your values. That doesn't mean that you come in with necessarily a position on a project or a certain type of treatment, on the landscape, but that, so you might have an open mind about how you get to those outcomes. But the outcome, that you're seeking, restoring a damaged watershed, for example, is really where you focus. And the pitfall is that it can feel really good to be getting along with other people in a collaborative, right? The process can feel nice as it moves along and you're part of something positive. And it can be a pitfall because that might lead you down the road that gets away from the outcomes that you're actually seeking. And so I would, it's something that, I think we have dealt with over the years as well. And it's a challenge.
I'll just reiterate that some of those principles for designing effective collaborative processes, those variables in the literature, sometimes I look at them and my eyes kind of glaze over, but they're true. So if you're in a group and there can often be struggles with maybe the facilitation isn't doing what it needs to do. Maybe the culture has gone in a direction that is not supporting an effective process. There are a lot of design principles that can make one group more effective than another. So speaking up about those is important as well if it's not working.
Thank you. Our next question from Harriet Cook says, how can public advocacy help facilitate true forest restorative practices, particularly adding the lens of climate urgency and the power of old growth forests to sequester carbon?
Could I ask you just repeat that again? It was a lot there, and I want to make sure we can think about it.
Absolutely. The question says, how can public advocacy help facilitate true forest restorative practices, particularly adding the lens of climate urgency and the power of old growth forests to sequester carbon?
Yeah, well, it might not happen through forest collaboratives, but it could. We touched on that as a potential in both the questions and some of the new directions from our government. But yeah, I mean, public advocacy absolutely has to play a role in elevating the role that forests play in mitigating climate change, for being a part of natural climate solutions. So there's a number of ways to do that. There's a number of efforts underway, including there was a panel on Tuesday about the role of old growth forests in climate change and some advocacy. So I think just finding out what those are ongoing. I mean, asking, for example, working with our government, our new government, to halt logging on old forests across the country would be a huge step in the right direction, and also help address some of the issues that we're dealing with in collaboratives, where if we take those controversial and damaging projects off the table, we can focus on promoting real restoration, whether it's addressing climate change or some other important issues.
And I might add, I would kind of look back to my first answer about sort of, rethinking how the fundamental way that we've been doing business for 100 and however many years, things are changing pretty dramatically. And so, there's like, defund the police, in my mind, should have been rethink the police. And I think we should rethink the Forest Service and fund the Forest Service in some of those new paradigms. And I won't go all the way down into the weeds, because I think that's a huge and a panel discussion unto itself that I'd actually love to listen to and or participate in. So I think that's a key piece. The other one is, I think that the reality is the agencies need to hear more about this, both from citizens, but also from decision makers, that it matters. So one of the things is, like, for instance, with the Trump screens, which got rid of the protections for large and old trees in Eastern Oregon, there's new science that shows very clearly that's going to have a net negative impact on climate. But the response we've gotten from some of the apologists, even one or two in the scientific community, is, as well as the Forest Service, and we see this certainly on the project level, is this is a global project. Who cares about, or a global problem? Who cares about this individual project, or even the 9 million acres of Eastern Oregon? It's more important that we change the the structure and composition and density of our forest. That's more important. And the reality is that this is a real crisis, and everybody needs to do their part. There's a Voltaire quote that our colleague Doug Heiken likes to drop sometimes in regards to this, which is, no snowflake ever feels like it's responsible for the avalanche. And I guess as a liberal snowflake, I'll say, that's true. We really all need to be doing collective action. And one of the best things science is showing us so clearly in Oregon, and not just the west side, but even the dry side over here, dry side, is that we need to be addressing how we are managing our forests. And that means protecting the largest and biggest trees, focusing, thinning smaller trees, those sorts of things, having longer rotations on private industrial lands. There's a lot of things we can do. And it's really important that we start taking those things seriously.
Thank you. Next, we have, how can public advocacy support collaborative reform given all of the real issues and inequities of the current collaborative system?
I'm thinking, Emily Jane, you might have some thoughts on that, but I might just jump in and say that it is hard because, some of the laws and policies and authorities that I touched on as far as, promoting collaboration and defining it or not defining it very well, and sort of pushing the proliferation of more forest collaboratives, they're laws or policies that in theory the people have a say over. But it's really hard to engage at that level of decision making and legislative sausage making for everyday citizens, for small nonprofits. So there's different groups, different like national level groups, elected officials who are making those decisions, those determinations about what goes into those laws. And often we're at the end of the line hearing about it once it's done. So it can be hard. Getting to your elected officials, letting them know, some of the things you'd rather see move forward in collaboration or included in laws. For example, not adding more categorical exclusions to exclude the public from decision making, might be a way to start.
Yeah, to that, I would add that collaboration isn't really sexy for decision makers. Like getting into the specifics of social processes, that's not very interesting to them. I think, as Chandra suggests, focusing on the enabling conditions that would make collaboration more successful, and that would make agencies better able to respond to diverse public values and interests, and would set everyone up for more success. I think that generally in policy, we see a tendency to try to keep collaboration pretty broad because there is a desire to not overprescribe or from top down say how it would look in every different place. So there's just a constant tension there between if you were to provide more structure and direction, there could be more clarity, but you also would run the risk of overprescribing a top down approach that wouldn't work in a bunch of different ecological and social settings.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and actually to that point too, Chandra brought up how some of these collaborative authorities are not well defined, and in some ways that's terrible because it's like, well, and we saw this on an industrial logging project in area surrounded by wilderness with all these endangered species, wild and scenic river corridor, and the Forest Service was able to say we collaborated, and they decidedly did not. And when they said they collaborated with environmental groups, it was Oregon Wild, and we're like, wait, we didn't even know this thing was happening. And I won't go down that rabbit hole. Read about the Lostein on our webpage. Anyway, and so on that hand, that's bad. But on the other hand, as Emily Jane points out, if you define it, it may not work. It might not be the right way to define it here, or it might for this particular project or this particular issue. And what happens if this person can't participate? And so it's a real tension, which really gets back to me to that underlying thing that I think I said 2 or 3 times and Chandra once or twice, which is good collaboration cannot be a substitute for, but a complement to, because I think some of these flaws are inherent and fundamental to collaboration because they're necessarily exclusive. All these other things we talked about. So I think if it is a substitute, or sorry, if it's a complement for, and they're doing the good work, there's not going to be litigation. There's not going to be, there's not going to be controversy over these projects. But if it's a fundamentally flawed collaborative, then we need to have other avenues to address it. And so when you take those away, as some of these laws are doing, and give it to the collaborative, suddenly you're giving too much power to a fundamental, potentially flawed outfit and decision-making process, and then the outcomes. And the last thing I might say about that is it also, again, gets to like NEPA, and we're at a law conference, or at a law conference, but fundamental laws like NEPA are really important. And what's so frustrating is I see the Forest Service and politicians spending more time and effort trying to find creative ways to get around it, or to increase the pace and scale, or efficiencies, and all these sorts of nice words of just doing less. If they spent 10% of that time, energy, and effort just doing the NEPA the right way, and again, with a fully funded agency that had all the information, because they had all of the different specialists out there getting the information to make good decisions, we would have much better outcomes. So again, I think it's just really, really important that if I had one takeaway of my, and there's all these important things that we've talked about, but is again that we have to maintain the ability of the public to hold the government accountable to its own laws, to ensure that there is sufficient analysis and public input and all of those sorts of things. Because collaboration is a great addition, but it can't be the standalone or the stand-in for those things.
So our next question, and I believe our last question, because we are running out of time, unfortunately, is, has Oregon Wild considered allocating more of its financial resources towards providing grants to the agencies for specific ecological goals, as opposed to fighting undesirable actions?
That's one where, we mentioned you've got to find groups that support your values and do the things you want to do. We're not a funding group. We fundraise because we're a nonprofit with pretty modest salaries, and a lot of our income comes from people writing $35 checks. We don't have the millions of dollars to really make that sort of change. But there are organizations and foundations, and quite frankly, your taxpayer dollars should be going to getting better outcomes, which is why it's so frustrating that we see, the Forest Service continue to get less and less funding. And then those very same people voting for less funding decry the fact that they aren't putting out good outcomes. And so there's a role in the broad spectrum of all of the different work that we do, to fund, to do science, to do advocacy, to do to facilitate, to do all of these different things. And there are organizations that do that. Our organization is an advocacy organization, and so part of that is advocacy to ensure that we have healthy public lands, wildlands, wildlife, and waters for future generations. And this is the way we go about doing that business. And we applaud others who are trying to come to good outcomes in different ways as well. And that's just not what we do. But if you want to write us a $10 million check and change our policy, we'll happily spend that $10 million in many of the ways you probably want.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, as it is 12:01, but I want to thank you all for participating in this panel, and I want to thank everyone who's watching the panel for taking the time to listen to what you all had to say.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm glad that we have digital PILT this year.